Hello and welcome to this month's CCAG public meeting. Tensions on the global stage are at their highest for decades, and the relationship between the United States and China is no exception. Political rows have been triggered by a range of issues, from geopolitical to so-called spy balloons. But the downward spiral in US-China relations poses a major risk, something far more threatening than diplomatic tensions, trade wars, or political gamesmanship. As the world scrambles to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees, the cost of a failure of cooperation between these two superpowers is unthinkable. Only last week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change gave yet another stark warning that current efforts to tackle the climate crisis fall far short of what is required. Urgent and unprecedented action is needed at a scale and speed that dwarfs the Industrial Revolution. We're talking massive reductions in emissions, the transition to clean energy, funding for loss and damage to countries most at risk of climate impacts. The list goes on. And all this will require political leadership and cooperation at the highest levels. But the world needs to be led by example. So today we ask, what are the roles of the US and China as climate leaders, and are they living up to these responsibilities? I'm joined by CCAG's Professor Ji and Alice Hill to share their perspectives on this. I'm also happy to welcome Laurie Miliverta, lead analyst at the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, and freelance climate journalist Xiaoying Yu. Thank you both so much for joining us. It's great to have you with us today. We are also joined, and we've been sent a pre-recorded question by Noah Gordon from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Noah, we're sorry you can't be here today, but we hope you've been able to join from home. Okay, let's focus first on the United States. Just last year, we saw US policymakers make the largest ever investment in climate mitigation through the Inflation Reduction Act. Yet since then, President Biden has approved major new oil and gas drilling in Alaska. So I suppose a good question to kick us off would be, is this one step forward and two steps back for the US? I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act was hailed as a landmark moment for the US climate policy. So why is it that we're still seeing new oil and gas exploration? Alice?
Well, I wouldn't call it two steps back, but it's certainly a step back. The approval was for the Willow project. It's a ConocoPhillips project that has been under examination since the Obama administration, and finally it came up for approval by the Biden administration. It allows drilling in a remote and rapidly warming part of the Arctic and will continue to emit carbon pollution for the next 30 years. So this isn't consistent with the United States position that it wants to lead on climate. It will contribute to the climate problem. Now, at the same time, Biden administration was announcing this Willow project, or just before the announcement, it also said it was going to cut back on some potential exploration in the Beaufort Sea in our state of Alaska from future oil and gas leasing, and then protecting certain other areas in the Arctic. Now, environmental groups have called this a climate bomb, but within the state of Alaska, and this is, I think, what has motivated the Biden administration, the project is widely supported, not by the Native Americans, the tribes that are in Alaska. There is some mixed support there. But among the elected officials, there is wide support. It's going to bring a lot of jobs. It also will continue to have oil flow through the Alaskan pipeline, which has suffered from a lack of oil, and that's affected the pipeline itself. So they want to get more oil going through there. And the state has had a deep relationship with oil. So the Biden administration was faced with a tough decision. And one of the leading proponents of this is Senator Lisa Murkowski, who has been willing to support climate action, but she also wanted the approval of the Willow Project. So it's a step back, and it's a step back internationally, and it's a step back domestically for President Biden in his goal of proving that the United States can lead on climate change.
Thank you, Alice. I mean, it feels like a dance that we don't want to do and we don't need to do. I guess the question is, the other question we people will be asking there is, how can we actually move forward? How can we start making inroads into coming up with solutions to the climate problem if the US are constantly making these steps backwards? I think oil playing such a large part, and I understand about the job side of things in Alaska, but it doesn't send out the right message, does it, as a leading nation?
Well, I think it points to the fact that fossil fuel interests are deeply embedded in our economy. And so navigating the politics of this is extremely difficult. Of course, President Biden is up for election in 2 years. If he loses, we could have another flip-flop for the United States on climate policy. And that has to be in the back of the minds of the Biden administration. How do we make sure that we can continue with our other portions of our climate agenda in a world where fossil fuel industry still has a major say in American policy? With that said, the IEA has said we've got to leave oil and fossil fuels in the ground in order to have a safe planet. So your question is well taken. It's difficult to see how we get there if we continue to pump more carbon into the atmosphere. And I think that what this decision has shown is that the United States cannot be the consistent leader that the Biden administration and President Biden, when he was running for election, presented that it would be. So this was a step back, as you've said.
Yeah, campaign with poetry and govern in prose. Yeah, is that the statement they say? So where does this place the US against other developed nations in meeting their climate commitments?
Well, I think the EU has done a remarkable job of driving some further commitments and becoming a leader in this fight to contain heating. The UK, with its climate law, has also shown some leadership. But all of the world needs to do a better job. It's not just the United States. Of course, the United States is the biggest historical emitter, so it has a lot of responsibility here, and it's the second largest emitter now. So there needs to be greater action. Unfortunately, the political scene here and the division between the two parties and a two-party political system has made progress remarkably choppy.
That's one way of putting it, Alice. Yeah, it still feels quite frustrating, but look, we'll get more and dig deeper into this later on. I want to move on to Professor Jia, and I'm keen to get your view on this. And my question to you is, why is it so important that the highest emitters take the lead in reaching the target of 1.5 degrees?
Well, I think the answer is pretty clear. When the top two leaders in greenhouse gas emissions account for 45% of the world total, and whatever they do will have huge impact on when or if we can actually ever achieve the net zero emissions. So it's so important. And if we go back a couple of years ago in 2015, just heading to the Paris climate conference when the two leaders of the leaders of the two countries, they actually cooperated quite well. They had a major joint announcement a year ahead of that, and a major joint presidential statement only 3 months ahead of that conference. Those cooperation actually played such an important role, set the foundation for the success of the Paris Agreement. Too bad those old good days are gone, and I mean this is so we need that kind of cooperation. We need actions from the top leaders. Of course, everybody counts. Then, but the top leaders must act.
As Alice has talked about, she talked a little bit about the realpolitik side of things in terms of, you know, two-party political situation, and also having to deal with the general public who are going to vote you into power and stuff. How do the leading nations, the US and China, deal with public expectations when you know you have a massive burden, you know, that not a burden, but you have to try and lead the world when it comes to committing to 1.5 degrees?
Well, I think just like what you just discussed, at least also talking about this case in the United States, right? Then Biden, we know he wants to play the leader, to be the leader on climate change, but he also, and the country of the United States is constrained by these political, economic, geopolitical realities. And this is this same thing can be true for China as well. For that matter, for the entire EU. I mean, this reality is pretty harsh to everybody right now, and that is why we see, unfortunately, a revival of fossil fuel production, extraction, consumption over the last year, 2 years. And this is the problem. And public expectation, of course, is very, very important. But let's just compare the dealing with climate change or dealing with the war ongoing right now, right? Then, the major parties are responsible for that. How they care about the public expectation for the war. I mean, that's really a hot war, right? So I think now, unfortunately, the world now is moving in that chaotic phase. I don't know how long that will last, but certainly, putting all this together is not really helping our effort on climate change, unfortunately.
No, thank you, Professor Xi. I mean, chaos is not what we need right now at all. Let's just move on to another question. And just last week, Antonio Gutierrez said that the US and EU should now be aiming to hit net zero emissions by 2040. Do you think China should follow suit? And how drastically will the Chinese government need to change its policy, climate policy, given their current 2060 target?
Well, the year 2020, September 2020, when President Xi Jinping made an announcement about the timing of carbon emissions peaking and also carbon neutrality. We're talking about 2030 for carbon peak and 2060 by 2060, that's for the carbon neutrality. When that was announced, scientists actually did an analysis. They showed that this, considering the responsibility and the size and the rate of increase or change of carbon emissions, and come to a conclusion that 2060 carbon neutrality actually is consistent with towards the 1.5 degree, not the 2.0 degree Celsius. So that was the analysis back then. Then, of course, China also made it clear in the year 2020, and the country will do everything they can to have a carbon peaking and carbon neutrality to come as early as possible. So I think that's China's actually taking that very seriously, probably different than many of other countries. I think I myself is on the optimistic side of that. Why? Because I see some of the mechanisms. For instance, some of the economic activities, taking these two examples, solar PV now is lower cost than coal-fired power plant here in China. So there is no economic case to make for coal-fired power plants, even though there are still a lot of interest in building new power plant. But I think that soon they can realize it does not really make economic case. Secondly, take another example, the EVs and the electric vehicles now in China. Last year, there was a 140% growth in purchasing of EVs. You can see the EVs really feels great when you drive it, and a lot of people, especially the young people now, and then they find it's not only clean, it's much cheaper. It's much cheaper to drive the EVs. So when things like this happening, which makes a lot of sense economically, I think we're moving in the right track. So for one, I think we need to develop our economy so that for this clean technology really accepted and make economic case.
So you don't think 2040 would be a realistic target in the Chinese government's eyes then?
No. I didn't really say that. I think I do not expect there is a major change in commitment for now, or in the near future. But I think this is because Chinese government tend to take this international commitment very, very seriously. They make the commitment only if they think they can actually achieve it. So I think that's why we see the government tend to be cautious making new adjustment to an earlier commitment.
Thank you, Professor Ji. And it's time. I think those were very interesting insights. But now, as we mentioned at the start, it's no secret that the tensions between the US and China are rising. But could this incentivize climate change? Now, to help us answer this, I'd like to bring in our first guest, and that's Lori Miliverta. Lori, it's great to have you here at your very first public meeting. Could you please give us a little bit of insight into your views on this topic between the US and China, alongside with your question for Alice and Ye?
For sure, thank you. So looking first at China, just as Professor Tsi described, the carbon neutrality commitment has led to major growth in clean energy, electric vehicles, electrification, and so on. At the same time, China's emissions have still continued to rise in the past years and through the COVID-19 pandemic. So now the really key question is how fast will China's emissions peak? Because we know it will happen before 2030, but how much before and at what level is really essential. China will probably reach the levels of clean energy growth that are consistent with the 1.5 degree pathways already this year or in the next year. So really the most important variable here is the rate of energy demand growth, because emissions will obviously peak when clean energy grows faster than total energy demand increases. And now, with the reopening after the pandemic, the policy choices that are made both in economic policy and energy policy will determine this. So the key question that I would like to ask from Professor Tsi is what do you see as the key drivers, the key determinants of when China's emission peak will take place and how fast emissions will fall after the peak? And to you, Professor, and to the other speaker as well, asking how can the United States or other partners, other parties like the EU use diplomacy, trade, or other tools to increase the incentive for China to peak emissions? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Laurie. That's a great question. Normally, we decompose the carbon emission into 4 factors: the population and per capita GDP, that's economic growth rate, and the energy intensity measured by energy consumption per unit of GDP, and also the carbon intensity per unit of energy. So when we look at the four factors, population is actually going down. It's going downward, and a lot of people worry about that. But for climate change and carbon emission, is a good news. Then per capita GDP, and people find it quite surprising. A lot of people find it quite surprising that the economic growth rate actually has slowed down in an unprecedented and unpredicted rate. So that also, when you do a prediction based on that, you would say, well, probably the carbon emission reduction will go faster. Now, for the last 2 factors, the energy intensity, and the country now is very much focusing on the service sector, especially the digital economy right now. I think that looking to the future, that will lead to a lower, even much lower, the energy intensity. And finally, for the carbon intensity per unit of energy, and as you just pointed out quite correctly, the China adjusted the non-fossil fuel target, and because the target is already achieved, it just exceeded the commitment already made during under the Paris Agreement. So that is also putting all factors together. Well, that is why I'm quite optimistic about the. But right now it is still going up a little bit. Mm-hmm. But my understanding, actually, I made this clear the 10 years ago. I think 2025 would be the peak. We'll see the peak 2025. We're talking about 2 years from now. 2 years from now, not too far. Then we'll probably see a plateau, then a little bit of fluctuations before it's just get decreased quickly. After a while, we're talking about 2030. We're talking about 2030 and beyond.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, for that. That was very, very interesting. I also want to go to Alice on that question. I'd like you to pick up there from Laurie's question, which was like, how can the EU and US and other countries increase the incentive for China to peak and decline their emissions as soon as possible? I mean, Professor Yu is talking about 2025, but is there anything else that you think that the EU and the US could be doing, Alice?
Well, the United States and the EU's relations with China are strained right now. I will note that they'll probably be further strained because the Taiwanese president arrived in the United States yesterday. And as competition and discord rise between these nations. The question is has been asked, what can be done? One of the most promising in the immediate future, I think, is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And in the United States, there is bipartisan, both Republican and Democratic support for this. Obviously, this is an initiative that has been pushed by the EU, and there has been interest in the United States by the Biden administration. The bipartisan support is based, I think, in the Republicans' case, on the fact that this would hurt China, but it would punish those nations, the trade, that are not driving quickly enough to reduce emissions. So that's one thing that I think is in play now and could be helpful. Another way that we can...
Alice, could you tell us a little bit about this initiative?
Yes, it's essentially that it's a basic trade scheme. It's a tariff. And for example, if you produce steel in a way, which is one of the heaviest emitting industries, in a way that is carbon intensive, then your goods would have a higher tariff on them when they're traded internationally, which means your goods are less attractive compared to steel that is produced with green energy and in ways that is less harmful to the climate. So this is a trade mechanism, but it also gets to another idea that has been in play, which is to essentially create a carbon club, a club of nations that are really committed to acting more quickly and imposing restrictions upon themselves, so that and others, so that they can improve the situation for the climate. So this is one mechanism for doing that, and it has gotten traction. So I would not be surprised if it comes to fruition, because it's so rare in the United States on anything related to climate to see the Democrats and the Republicans be able to agree. So I would say watch this space. And then another area is looking at aid to developing countries to help them get off fossil fuels. The Belt and Road Initiative, which has been a major effort by the Chinese, has stumbled in some countries, and that could create an opportunity for countries interested in helping make sure that the developing world, as they power up, and they do need power, choose clean energy sources and leave their fossil fuels in the ground if possible. And then a third is through debt relief. Of course, China is one of the, I think, the largest bilateral lender in the world, but there is a new approach, which is swapping debt. Many of the countries, by the way, in the developing world are just saddle or have an albatross around their neck, exploding debt after the pandemic that is really undermining their economic viability. So one new development is a swap of debt for conservation, for other climate goals. So reducing that debt load in exchange for improving their climate work to reduce emissions and to choose cleaner energy. So I think there are a lot of ways that we could find to put pressure on China to improve its action. They would also, in some instances, isolate China. But China has the same interest that all countries do. It's very severely impacted by climate change, and it needs to make sure that heating is contained to keep its own population safe, just as the United States, the EU need to do that as well.
Thank you, Alice. I mean, there's so much there that I could unpack. From both Alice and Professor Xi. Yeah, and that's all your fault, Laurie, for asking such a good question. Thank you so much for joining us today, but I do have to move on. And next, I'm going to hand over to climate journalist Xiaoying Yu. Xiaoying, thank you also for joining us today. And could you please introduce yourself and your experience on today's topic and put your question to our panel?
Hello, everyone. My name is Xiaoying. I'm a freelance climate journalist based in London, and I write for a range of publications, including China Dialogue, Semaphore, and Climate Home News. I was previously China editor at Carbon Brief. So thank you for everyone for sharing insights on the topic. I've got a question for both Alice and Professor Qi Ye. So we talked a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act. So my understanding is part of the Act's aim is to enhance the manufacturing and supply chains of the renewable industry inside the United States. We all know that trade cooperation is an important part of climate cooperation, and the two countries have been talking, holding talks on climate cooperation for some time now. So, for example, the US imports a lot of solar panels from China. So, how has the IRA affected the climate dynamics between the two nations? Does that mean that climate cooperation would need to go hand in hand with competition from now on?
Great question, Xiaoying. Professor Xi, would you like to take that one first?
Well, I think the climate cooperation actually went really well for a while, even until the year 2021, heading to the Glasgow conference, climate conference. That year, we know the special envoy, special representative of the president on climate change from China, Minister Xie, and held 22 direct conversations, dialogue with John Kerry, the special envoy from the United States. So that's how much we see the cooperation that really needed, and it went really well. Unfortunately, we no longer see that right now, and we see some voices inside both countries, and some of the voices are not so pro cooperation, then which is quite disappointing. And according to the Secretary of State Blinken, he identified this framework as cooperation, confrontation, and competition. And like Xiaoying said, it's pretty. I mean, that framework is great on its surface, but when it comes to implementation, it's pretty hard, right? That on the one hand, you advocate competition and confrontation. On the other hand, you would really need cooperation, so that the implementation of that framework is really, really, really hard. And Alice just talked about this carbon border tariff, or in the discussing in the Congress right now, and also the CBAM in the EU. And in the past 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago, when we're talking about this, we called them trade barriers. And we mean that is not a very good thing. But now, with these green barriers, and we now treat that as a great thing. You actually have a moral ground for that nowadays. So I'm actually afraid that we are, to some extent, moving from trade war to green trade war to some extent. So I think that the cooperation is really what we need. But right now, we see more competition. We just need to manage that competition, not just like into confrontation. I think that's at the moment, best we can hope. Right. Xiaoying was talking about this example on the solar PV And if we have that carbon border adjustment tariff between the two countries, I think that is almost over for that kind of cooperation. Means production of solar PV panels in China and installation and deployment in the United States. That kind of thing probably will be gone because of this very high additional tariff to that. I think that's something we need to be aware of. But now maybe I can just add a little bit. China was very worried when CBAM was first proposed in the EU, but now China seems to be not that worried anymore because as I said, the overall structure is going lighter, and the carbon intensity of the overall economy is just moving down. I'm not talking about the overall volume of emission. I'm talking about the carbon intensity. So, for instance, China is the biggest producer, user, and exporter of electric vehicles right now, right? So that kind of trade tariff probably is not going to against China in some areas. Then, but still, I think we should not weaponize any kind of measures like that. Instead, we need to design some measures that really promote a better cooperation among the countries and regions.
Thank you, Professor. Alice, I'm sensing this carbon border tariff or these green barriers is going to become another bone of contention in this journey of ours to combat climate change. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, but also answer the main thrust of the question from Xiaoying, which is, does it mean cooperation will now need to go hand in hand with competition?
Well, I think we're going to see more competition because the Inflation Reduction Act is designed to propel particularly industries located in the United States to become major players in green technology. And we've seen that China, particularly with solar, did grow into the major player in solar. And the Inflation Reduction Act is designed to give a boost to the United States. It's having some interesting fallout with regard to China. For example, in the state of Virginia, the Republican governor rejected a Ford plant for batteries that would have brought thousands of jobs to an economically depressed area simply because he claimed that there was a China connection and he didn't want to empower China. So we are definitely seeing an uptick in the tensions and also political ploy, perhaps, because there is this anti-China sentiment now. And then we've seen the economic realities of this with a fight over tariffs again, but these are tariffs on solar panels. And one of our departments, the Commerce Department, has said that Chinese solar manufacturings were circumventing trade tariffs by routing US-bound solar supplies through Southeast Asian countries. So that was going to be cut off. Now the solar industry has said, wait a minute, you can't do that. We need these panels. We can't meet our climate goals without these panels. So there is an internal political battle going on as to whether those tariffs should remain suspended for 2 years, as President Biden has proposed, or whether they should be put back in place. So the competition gets complex given the different strengths of the countries and what they can bring to the table with green technologies. And of course, there's been tension with the EU with the Inflation Reduction Act because it is so US focused and rewards companies who do business in the United States and bring their manufacturing facilities and money to the United States.
Thank you, Alice. I mean, we're just literally touching on the complexity and the mesh of international relations. And I mean, there's a part in my brain that just keeps saying, why can't we all just get along? But I know it's far more complicated than that. But I also think it's prescient that we remember the goal, and that is to create a safer planet for all of us. So it doesn't matter how much we squabble and fight to improve our economies. If we haven't got a safer planet for all of us, none of that is going to matter. Look, let's move on to our next question and our next guest. But also, thank you very much to Zhao Ying for that question. It was really good to have you on your first public meeting, and a great question. Okay, it feels like a good time for us to go to our pre-recorded question now from Noah Gordon. And Noah recently published a piece in Internationale Politik Quarterly on how international rivalries can actually help reduce emissions. That sounds really interesting. Okay, let's hand it over to Noah.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm sorry I can't be there with you live this time. I look forward to watching the recording of this meeting. My name is Noah Gordon, and I am acting co-director of the new Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics program at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C. My research focuses on how climate change and the responses to it will change international affairs and alter the landscape for foreign and security policymakers. For example, I recently published a paper on how climate change is opening up opportunities for violent non-state actors. Thanks to Alice Hill for her comments on that one. But I'm here today to talk about US-China relations and the quest to keep warming to 1.5 degrees amid high tensions between competing superpowers. It is clear that international cooperation is essential in some areas. After all, we need shared standards to facilitate trade in low-carbon goods, whether physical or financial, and it would be good for countries to coordinate the phase-out of fossil fuel production. However, in some areas, competition between opposing blocs or powers can actually be beneficial. Governments take some climate action regardless of what other countries do, perhaps because they want to capture a growing market or simply add useful electricity to their grid. And we have seen competition spur climate action in some cases, as when China increased its ambition after the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, or how the US Senate was persuaded to pass the Inflation Reduction Act because of fears about over-reliance on China. So my two-part question for our esteemed speakers today is, in which areas is climate cooperation essential, and where can competition between competing powers actually spur useful climate action? Thank you.
Fascinating, actually. I'll be really interested to hear our panel's thoughts on this. So I'll go to you first, Professor Xi.
Well, there are some traditional areas really important for cooperation, and the commitment, the ambition on commitment, climate commitment. The second one is on technology, and third one is on finance. And all the three areas are so important if the countries, especially the big ones, can come together and cooperate on that. But we also know that is very, very hard. It has been hard ever since 1992 when we had this UNFCCC thing. It's not easy. And the technology part is also played. I think Noah made a very good point. At this moment, every country is trying to compete for this advantage in technology. And I think that was also the strategy for China as well in the clean technology ever since 20 years ago, when the first legislation on renewable energy law was made, and that was made very clear. And China actually put in a lot of resources on that, taking the EV, for example, a lot of the subsidies in that area, a lot of subsidies on solar PV as well. I think that kind of competition can be beneficial. But as I said, at the same time, if we can work together, then that can probably even accelerate the development of the technology. And the solar PV that, as we know, in China is developed, is taking the technology from Germany, Europe, from the United States, as when also. So that kind of cooperation actually played an extremely important role. And at certain stage, and I do agree, certain stage in certain areas, and the competition is really raising to the top rather than raising to the bottom. I think that also very important. But overall, I think the cooperation is good for the long term, and the competition may be good for the short term.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. Alice, let's hear your thoughts on this. Where can competition between competing powers spur useful climate change?
Well, I think it's a great question, and a great question from Noah. I agree with the professor that competition over technology can be helpful. We need technological solutions. We have heard from the IPCC and the IEA that carbon capture has to be a part of this, figuring out how to get rid of some of the carbon that we've already put in the atmosphere. So to the extent that we can have broader technological competition to find out what the solutions are, that could be very helpful. Unfortunately, right now, we seem to be more in a tit for tat relationship with Beijing revising its export-import guidelines to restrict the export of certain solar equipment, not the panels, and then the U.S. Taking action to restrict semiconductors to China. So the lack of cooperation there, I think, can be understood from a geopolitical sense in protecting their own industries, but it is harmful to our greater goals of cutting emissions and containing warming. So as we go forward, an area where I think cooperation would be extremely helpful and extremely important is on this issue of loss and damage. One of the things that's becoming very clear is that climate change poses national security risks. We're going to have millions of people suffering from food insecurity, water insecurity, and as Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez said, people on the move in biblical proportions. And that is highly destabilizing to the globe. So to the extent that countries can rally, and I think it's important that China be a part of this, to assist other nations. The United States has a big responsibility as the historically largest emitter, but China has a big responsibility as by far the largest current emitter and anticipated to be even a larger emitter for some time. So finding ways to help other nations deal with their climate threats and invest in clean technology is crucial to ensure that there's a peaceful world going forward.
Thank you, Alice. You strayed into a topic which I think we're going to go more in depth on in the future on our CCAG panels in terms of loss and damage, and I think it's another really important topic. But listen, thank you to both of you, Professor Xi, and also to Alice, and again to Noah for such an insightful question. And with that, I'm afraid I have to draw today's meeting to an end. As always, a huge thank you to our guests who have sent in their questions today, and of course to Professor Xi and Alice Hill. It's been a very insightful session today. So thank you to everyone for taking part, and to everyone at home for tuning in. So until next time, stay safe, goodbye, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.